some of the material that she sent me so that I could prepare for this talk, and also her partner Henry Schur. So let's look at, I just want to begin by looking at the passage of the so-called Black Codes in the years right after Reconstruction. Now these codes facilitated the mass incarceration of former slaves for committing crimes like what? Vagrancy, absence from work, ownership of firearms, or violations of racial etiquette. Well, these were practices that were only illegal if you happened to be black. They were perfectly legal if you were white. They were practices that were legal as long as one remained white. So during slavery, there were no blacks in prison because punishment was carried out by the so-called master of the plantation. But what happened immediately after emancipation in the South? What happened almost overnight was that prisons turned black. Almost overnight. What occurred was the practice of what was called convict leasing, a way of increasing bound labor. And during this time, the situation was so grave that I think it was Frederick Douglass that referred to incarcerated blacks as prisoners of war rather than criminals. And now, here we are in 2015. We have a renewed interest in prison labor, so-called bound labor, all over the country. Paul Street calls prison privatization in the United States correctional Keynesianism. And I think he's right on the mark. The prison population has grown from about 196,000 inmates in 1972 to over 2.3 million today, making the United States what Paul Street refers to as the world's largest jailer in the span of just 30 years, in the span of just 3 decades. The United States has become the world's largest jailer. Or, as Paul Street notes, the first genuine prison society in history. There are more African Americans incarcerated today, for instance, than there were in 1850, which was about, roughly speaking, a decade before the Civil War began. According to a report released by the Pew Center in March 2009, 1 in every 31 U.S. adults resides in the corrections system. Let's take a second and break these numbers down racially. And if we do this, the numbers become 1 in 11 is African American, 1 in 27 is Latino, and 1 in 45 is white. Some states even determine how many prison cells to build based on 4th grade reading scores and graduation rates. As Susan Searles notes, the decision to invest in prison construction over and at the expense of already cash-strapped schools reveals the degree to which investor returns on a hot growth industry like corrections far outweigh the social returns of an educated and engaged public. And Searles Giroux notes, in an economy and society refashioned by a highly rationalized neoliberal logic, openness and freedom now characterize the movement of markets, not citizens. Markets can move. They do. They're open. They're unfettered. The barriers are taken away. We can talk about Larry Summers and the Glass-Steagall Act and all of that, but I won't get into all the history of that. But now markets are open. Citizens aren't. Citizens are being locked up. They're being constrained as the market's open. By 1992, the carceral apparatus of the United States was approaching an average rate of arrest for young black males of 1 in 3 between the ages of 20 and 29. A ratio that would meet and surpass, with that statistic becoming almost 1 in 2 in the nation's capital by 2004. What is less known is the impact of mass incarceration of black women, which increased more than, check this out, 859% in the decade of the 1990s. Now the year 1992 was a kind of watershed year in this respect. It saw the incarceration and sentencing of Cornelia Whitner for, quote, endangering the life of her unborn child, end of quote. A judicial decision in a landmark case that would spark a media-manufactured crack baby epidemic. I remember that very vividly back in 1992, which was the year I came to UCLA, actually. I was recruited by UCLA the year of Rodney King, the uprising, so that was 1992, the so-called crack baby epidemic, and led to the criminalization of pregnancy among young black and Latino women, as well as conditions, not unlike those produced under chattel slavery, of black women giving birth in chains, only to have their babies forcibly removed from them by the state. The year 1992, very interesting year, was notable for the fact that while the Get Tough movement remained popular in Washington, and of course it remained very popular with the electorate, its only demonstrable successes were in sending more young black males to prison than to college. Right? Now, I would also say that as early as 2001, ACLU Director Graham Boyd noted that the United States was incarcerating African American men at a rate approximately 4 times the rate of incarceration of black men in South Africa under apartheid. Worse still, we've managed to replicate, at least on a statistical level, the shame of chattel slavery in this country. The number of black men in prison, I already mentioned this, is already equal to the number of men enslaved in 1820. And if current trends continue, only 15 years remain before the United States incarcerates as many African American men as were forced into chattel bondage at the peak of slavery. Well, it's interesting. 1992, California became home to the largest prison building program in the history of the world. The result of tough on crime and anti-urban strategies, as well, Searles Giroux notes, as progressive era rehabilitation efforts that sought, nonetheless, to maintain racial hierarchies. Greater and greater proportions of the state appropriations, and this is where the universities come in, and new opportunities for capital investment went to the California Department of Corrections, or the CDC. Right? They got tons of money. And everyone wanted a piece, including the universities. So that the massive size and flexible budget of the California Department of Corrections prompted waves of critical study by state universities. But the focus of these studies was not to challenge the political exploitation of an electorate whose fears of crime are fueled by an ever-increasing media reportage, right? Even in periods when crime rates were stabilized or fell. No. Nor was it to raise ethical or philosophical questions about the shifting nature of incarceration from rehabilitation to punishment, because that was the focus. Let's move from rehabilitation to punishment. No, universities didn't begin to question these at all. They didn't want to raise sociological or criminological questions about disproportionate rates of poor and minority youth behind bars. No, that wasn't the focus of the universities. Not generally speaking, or in the main. Or even the effectiveness of incarceration among a range of criminal justice responses that are demonstrably cheaper, for instance. No, that wasn't the response of the university. The response, according to Searles Giroux, was the pitched competition between the California Department of Corrections and all the other state agencies dependent on the general fund that seems to have prompted the university to criticize the CDC in such a way that the university itself would become a necessary player in the California Department of Corrections project as a supplier of efficiency expertise. That's what the universities began to do. In other words, university researchers became the engineers who conducted these studies in the interest of placing themselves in direct line with the CDC's massive funding stream. Ruth Gilmore has an interesting conclusion to all of this. And she said not only did the university refuse to question the identification of crime itself as a central problem, no. The university saw and refigured all of this as an engineering problem in the interest of cost reduction. So to this end, Gilmore notes that in 1995, the Regents of the University of California formally shed affirmative action over the objections of faculty, the objections of staff, the objections of students and senior administrators at the university's 9 campuses, because in the race-neutral language of racism, affirmative action is not a very efficient mode of resource allocation. Right? So it's just, you can't make a lot of money on affirmative action. So let's get rid of it. Let's jettison it. Thus, the rise of so-called street terrorism affected those disciplines that deal directly or indirectly with the criminal justice system, and its expanding prison complex. And Searles-Giroux goes on to note that community colleges throughout the state, throughout California, rush to offer associate degrees in correctional science to meet the needs of the immediate new labor market of new prisons. I think I was reading somewhere too, and I was supposed to look it up. I reminded myself to look it up last night, but I forgot. I think I was reading somewhere in Arizona, the government, the legislature, or somebody promised these new corporations of private corporations that want to build prisons an incarceration rate, a guaranteed incarceration rate. I think they were going to turn, they offered to turn, right, they offered to turn just misdemeanors into felonies. You know, let's just turn just misdemeanors into felonies. That will guarantee you a certain incarceration rate. So come to our state and build your private prisons. So anyway, I wanted to talk about that because I wanted to show the relationship between the school-to-prison pipeline and the response of universities in the main. And of course, there were some, I'm sure, radical researchers and certain student groups that were not participating in this kind of studied response. But this was the general response from the universities. Now, this is very interesting because right around this time, we look at the Safe Schools Act of 1994. This is only 2 years later. So what do we find? We find that it was patterned after the landmark 1968 Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. This is something that Jonathan Simon, in his study, a very famous study called Governing Through Crime, this is one of his findings, that which Congress appropriated significant new funds, conditioning eligibility for this funding on the adoption by states and local school boards of techniques of knowledge and power calculated to focus more governance, attention, and resources on crime in schools. So, in other words, if you wanted to apply for funding or, under the Safe Schools Act, and you wanted to qualify for this federal money, right? Schools must demonstrate that they have a serious problem with crime, a serious problem with violence, and a serious problem with student discipline. And, of course, some strategies to resolve this, of course. While school administrators were required to develop their own forms of data collection about crime, as well as assess what kinds of incidents constitute criminal activity. This was up to the superintendent of the schools or the principal of a particular school to do this, under conditions that provide every incentive to make such judgments as broad and expansive as possible, according to Searles-Giroux. That's her words, not mine. But it really is quite telling. So let's think of ways of turning our school into a really massively violent institution, and the more funding we'll get from the Safe Schools Act. Moreover, effective measures and techniques for dealing with the problem of school crime, or what Simon calls, and I love this term, penal pedagogies. They've been lifted directly, according to Giroux, from criminal justice settings. And if you look at Henry Giroux's brilliant work on higher education, you can read his writings on zero tolerance policy, the implementation of school uniforms, school detentions, and the like. So we're basically seeing a total transformation of what now constitutes educational reform. Now, a lot of the statistics from that part of my talk were from Susan Searles' work, Susan Searles-Giroux, and here's Henry, and I just want to give you a couple of quotations from Henry, because in a sense, Henry's work, Henry and I got to work together for 8 years at Miami of Ohio, actually, when I couldn't find a position in a university in Canada because I'd written a very controversial book in 1980. They were still punishing me for it back in 1984 when I finally got my PhD. Henry invited me to come and work with him and at Miami University of Ohio after he was fired in 1983 by John Silber from Boston University. The student newspaper uncovered a hit list, and that hit list of John Silber, President John Silber of Boston University, included Howard Zinn, Henry. Zinn had tenure, so I think they froze his salary. Henry didn't have tenure, so they found a way to get rid of him. Silber did. Even though people like Paulo Freire were writing letters to the university saying, you know, Giroux is one of the greatest educational philosophers in the country, etc., but none of that mattered. So Henry ended up having to leave, and he finally got hired, remarkably, at Miami University of Ohio, and so that's a whole other story I told at lunch, and I don't want to go through all that. Maybe later. So Giroux writes, and I would agree with this overall theme, although there are in some instances Henry and I disagree, but I would agree with, overwhelmingly with his comments, and I quote, viewed as a private investment rather than public good. Universities are now constructed spaces where students are valued as human capital, courses are determined by consumer demand, and governance is based on the Walmart model of labor relations. This attack on higher education, which is not only ideological, but also increasingly relies on the repressive, militaristic arm of what he calls the punishing state, is a response to the democratization and opening up of universities that reached a high point in the 1960s all across the globe. And according to Giroux, in the last 40 years, the assault on the university as a center of critique and democratization has intensified, just as the reach of this assault has expanded to include intellectuals, campus protesters, an expanding number of students of color, and the critical formative cultures that provide the foundation for a substantive democracy. So Giroux calls upon students to critically interrogate what stands for public engagement, to show how this debased mode of being in the world gains prominence in the public sphere. And Giroux makes these telling comments about governance, university governance. And he writes that governance under higher education is being stripped of any viable democratic vision. Finally, though far from complete, he writes, there is a need to oppose the ongoing shift in power relationships between faculty and the managerial class. Too many faculty are now removed from the governing structure of higher education, and as a result have been abandoned to the misery of impoverished wages, excessive classes, no health care in certain circumstances, and few, if any, social benefits. As political scientist Benjamin Ginsberg points out, administrators and their staffs now outnumber full-time faculty, accounting for 2/3 of the increase in higher education costs in the past 20 years. This is shameful, Giroux knows, and is not merely an education issue, but a deeply political matter, one that must address how neoliberal ideology and policy have imposed on higher education an anti-democratic governing structure. That was interesting, and I was looking at the history of some of this, because I was mentioning in an earlier talk today, I was mentioning when I came in 1985 to the United States, I came to work with Henry, and our theme was critical citizenship. And the year I arrived in the United States from Canada was 1985, and I remember I was reading about corporations, some studies of corporations, and I was looking at the gross domestic product, right, of certain countries, and I began to see this trend. And I thought, my God, corporations are now becoming much more powerful than some countries. And then I kind of, over the years, kind of mapped out some of these statistics, and I thought, my God, there's no way we will ever have critical citizenship again if these trends continue, and they've only intensified. We're going to have consumer citizenship. What did George Bush Jr. say after September 11, 2001? If you want to help the country, go out and spend. So I think the focus has been on consumer citizenship rather than critical citizenship. And the point I want to raise is it possible at all to have a focus on critical citizenship in a neoliberal capitalist society? My feeling is that we can't. That doesn't mean we can't try, but I feel we can. So I've looked at other places. In my work, I think the most exciting work that I've done has been with the late President Chavez in Venezuela, in looking at what the Bolivarian Revolution is attempting to do educationally. Now, I'm not suggesting by any means that Venezuela achieved socialist democracy, but at least they were struggling fighting for the conditions of possibility to try to make that happen. And I know that Chavez has gotten bad rap here instead of in the United States. So, but that's something that I don't know if I'm going to have time to talk much about Venezuela, but I've written about it. But I was looking at some of the history, and I found it in one of Henry's articles. In the early 1970s, Giroux turns our attention to what he calls the Powell Memo. Not Colin Powell. It was released in August 23rd, 1971, and it was authored, well, who is Powell? It was authored for the Chamber of Commerce by Lewis F. Powell, Jr., who would later be appointed as a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. Powell identified the U.S. college campuses in 1971 as, quote, the single most dynamic source for producing and housing intellectuals who are unsympathetic to the free enterprises. He recognized that one crucial strategy in changing the political composition of higher education was to convince university administrators, and this is Henry, and boards of trustees that the most fundamental problem facing universities was the lack of conservative educators, or what he labeled the imbalance of many faculties. The Powell Memo, writes Giroux, was designed to develop a broad-based strategy, not only to counter dissent, but also to develop a material and ideological infrastructure with the capability to transform the U.S. public consciousness through a conservative pedagogical commitment to reproduce the knowledges, to reproduce the values, to reproduce the ideology and social relations of the corporate state. And Giroux writes, not only did the Powell Memo understand and take seriously the educative nature of politics, it also realized that if a crisis of economics was not matched by a crisis of ideas, it was easier to reproduce a society in which conformity could be bought off through the swindle, Mrs. Henry, through the swindle of a neoliberal mantra that used the discourse of freedom, individuality, mobility, and security to serve the interests of the rich and the powerful. So that according to Giroux, this Powell Memo was very historically significant. In fact, it was the most influential of one of a number of ideological interventions in the 1970s that developed political roadmaps to crush dissent on campuses, to eliminate tenure, and transform the university into what Henry calls an adjunct of free market fundamentalism. But it certainly was not the first shot fired as part of a larger conservative struggle to shape U.S. higher education. And so Giroux goes on to talk about faculty members consigned to the service of Walmart workers, stripped of full-time positions, relegated to the status of stoop laborers, lacking power, security, and a living wage, and largely devoid of any hope for a full-time position in the academy in the near future. According to the American Association of University Professors, yay, at the present moment, more than 50% of faculty are adjuncts, barely able to pay for their rent, conduct research, and exercise any influence over the increasing corporatization and militarization of higher education. Many part-time faculty members, we know this, make less than $21,000 annually. And as Coleman McCarthy points out, slog like migrant workers from campus to campus. A record number, according to Giroux, of adjuncts are now on food stamps and receive some form of public assistance. Given how little they are paid, this should not come as a surprise. It does not make it any less shameful, according to Henry. And I might say, and so we're looking at this historically. In 2006, I want to mention this very quickly. There was an organization called the Bruin Alumni Association, and I was at UCLA for 20 years, and I've just left to go and fight the struggle behind the Orange Curtain in Orange County. It was very interesting because in 2006, the Bruin Alumni Association, which was a fake UCLA association, but comprised of some former UCLA students, one or two students who managed to get lots of money in corporate funding from Republican politicians, lawmakers. They launched an attack on 30 professors at UCLA in 2006. You can find it if you want. Just look Dirty 30. Look up the Dirty 30 and Peter McLaren. They put me on the list as the most dangerous professor at UCLA. Things were never the same for me after that. They also offered to pay students $100 to secretly audio tape my classes, $50 to produce any notes. I don't know if they're still offering that. I noticed some of you guys are still make 50 fast bucks, sent it to the Bruin Alumni Association. And I know that they've paid for lawsuits and encouraged students to engage in lawsuits against UCLA. And so I found this out on the eve of the World Educational Forum in Caracas. And you know what was interesting? The only public group that really went out to defend me. Nobody did in the United States, and nobody really, I was on NPR and LA Times, and it became an international incident as the new McCarthyism. But the Chavistas publicly denounced this in Venezuela. They stood up at the World Educational Forum and publicly denounced this witch hunt against 30 professors at UCLA. Now I want to shift a little bit to the work of Mike Neary. Now Mike Neary is a wonderful professor in the UK, in the University of Lincoln. And Neary sounds in some ways like the European counterpart of Henry, or maybe Henry's the US counterpart of Mike. And I want to talk about some of Neary's findings about the Knowledge Liberation Front and groups that are attempting to reclaim the university. And I'll kind of end there. But I want to start with a quote from Michael Neary. He's at the University of Lincoln in the UK. The attempt to promote a marketized system of higher education is being done at a time when the market model for social development is at the point of collapse. It's becoming increasingly clear that the market-based model for social development is not sustainable, for one thing. And attempts to prolong it have devastating consequences, not only for universities, but for the population of Europe and the world. So what Neary is talking about really has absolute direct relevance for what's happening in the United States, and I find this everywhere. I mean, I talk a lot, mostly in Latin America. My Spanish is terrible, but I managed to find a way to make it happen. And I find that the same kind of issues that we're talking about here today are the similar kinds of issues that folks are talking about all around the world. We're talking about the transnational capitalist class, after all. We're talking about transnational capitalism. So the kind of problems we're facing are not unique to this country. I want to summarize some points that Neary makes from an article he published in the Journal of Critical Educational Policy Studies, where I serve as the international editor, or North American editor, sorry. Professor Neary is making references to new models of the university in Europe, but I believe that much of what he says is applicable to the North American context. How much time do I have? Just so I know. 5? Whoa, okay.
So we've got some
okay, all right. Can we do 10? All right, let's do 10. All right, I'm looking at my watch. Is this a big enough watch? I'm looking. Okay, 10 minutes. So here's what he's saying. He's been to all kinds of meetings of radical educators around Europe, and I really like some of his findings. Now, he takes us to Europe in the history of a university called Paris 8. Paris 8 was bulldozed in 1980 and moved out of Paris to the suburbs of Saint-Denis, a victim of its own success in radicalizing students. And he talks about basically Paris 8 becoming revitalized again as a university, certainly after the 2001 battle in Seattle, the summit mobilizations in Birmingham, England, against the G8 in 1998, the Zapatista rebellion in Mexico, the revolts in Argentina and Bolivia in 2000, or in Africa against the IMF sanctions in the 1980s. So anyway, whatever the starting point, these protests converged into a constellation of struggles by academics, by students, by activists, and those who would never regard themselves as activists, against the police and the state, reacting against the impossibility of life under capitalism. And this is quite amazing. And of course, we can relate this also to the Indignados, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, recent insurrections and rebellions in Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Oman, Morocco, Israel, and Libya. So, Paris 8 in Saint-Denis, at the beginning of 2011, the Edu Factory Collective, an autonomous educational network, organized a meeting at Paris 8. Now, if you want to read a fantastic book, you can download it from the internet. It's called Edu Factory, EDU-Factory. Written by academics, but it's quite amazing. So they organized a meeting at Paris 8 to develop a political capacity for a new university and to reclaim the commons through the creation of a new Europe based on rights and based on access. And some of the groups that appeared at Paris 8 included the University of Utopia, the All-Nepal National Free Student Union, the Carrot Workers Collective, Critical Legal Thinking, Direct Action from Ukraine, the Slow University of Warsaw, Falco No for Berlin, the Pan-Africa Student Council from Gambia, the Street University of Russia, the Association of the Blacklisted Students of Tokyo, and Upping the Ante from Canada. Some groups have tried to attend the event from North Africa, but they weren't granted visas. Now, the struggle over what participants called the common and the joint declaration included the following statements from the attendees. And this is what they said. I'm just going to kind of summarize here. Since the state and private interests collaborate in the corporatization process of the university, our struggles don't have the aim of defending the status quo. Governments bail out banks and cut education. We want to make our own university. A university that lives in our experiences of autonomous education, alternative research, and free schools. It's a free university, run by students, precarious workers, and migrants, a university without borders. This weekend, we have shared and discussed our different languages and our common practices of conflict, demonstrations, occupations, and metropolitan strikes. We have created and improved our common claims. Free access to the university against increasing fees and costs of education, new welfare and common rights against debt and the financialization of our lives, and for an education based on cooperation, against competition, and against hierarchies. So they agreed on a new name for this group, which they called this kind of revolutionary caravan they called the Knowledge Liberation Front, or the KLF, which is obviously a reaction to the global recession of 2008 and the role of the university in the economic and social politics of austerity, driven by what Naomi Klein famously called the shock doctrine. Okay. So the question, of course, is, and I'll just leave this as a question, how are such politics being enforced through institutions of higher education? The Edu Factory Collective is based on a critique of the global crisis of capitalism. The idea here is that it has now become impossible to respond to the changes in higher education without placing those changes in the context of labor and production and the social relations of capitalist work, or what the Edu-Factory Collective refers as the social factory. Social factory. Is the university today just as important as the factory was in the days of industrial capitalism in terms of the struggle between capital and labor? Is it just as important in terms of the reproduction of labor force and the creation of social and cultural stratifications? Has cognitive capitalism become a new regime of accumulation, a training ground for capitalist cognitive labor? And I'll end here. Almost. Okay. Knowledge had now become a key commodity, this is nearer, in the process of valorization, and the university the key site of production of commodified knowledge. Any sense of knowledge being produced for a common good, or that academic work requires open networks of collaboration, was now being enclosed behind intellectual property laws. Student debt, budget cuts, knowledge transfers, marketization and privatization. The valorization of knowledge has produced a new regime of accumulation. Cognitive capitalism, with universities a new training ground for a new form of cognitive labor. As the primary source of cognitive labor, students came to see themselves as the most precarious form of capitalist work. So, what the strategy has been is the creation of co-research, breaking down questions of borders between research and politics, between knowledge and conflicts, between the university and social context, and between work and militancy. So, and it's been creating an autonomous institution, the University of the Common, and then Neary gets into some of the approaches he's using, militant co-research with students at the University of Lincoln in the UK as a way of challenging the neoliberal university. And I won't have time to say much about that, except to say of the creation of what could be called the undercommons. And he talks about maroon communities of composition teachers, mentorless graduate students, adjunct Marxist historians, or queer management professors, state college ethnic studies departments, closed down film programs, visa-expired Yemeni student newspaper editors, historically black college sociologists, and feminist engineers. And what will the university say of them? It will say they are unprofessional. How do those who exceed the profession, who exceed and by exceeding escape? How do those maroons problematize themselves, problematize the university, force the university to consider them a problem, a danger? The undercommons are always at war, always in hiding. Now, this is the end. I wanted to quote Che Guevara. And many folks don't know that I've written a book on Che Guevara and Paulo Freire, and many folks don't know that Che Guevara was awarded an honorary doctorate in pedagogy. And I was able to find part of the speech he gave after accepting the honorary doctorate in pedagogy at the University of Las Villas. And I'm going to end my talk by quoting from Che. And he was trying to shift the parameters of the Latin American university. Of Latin American university, from the European university to the Latin American university. And he wrote this. He said this in front of an audience like this: I would never think of demanding that the distinguished professors or the students presently associated with the University of Las Villas perform the miracle of admitting to the university the masses of workers and peasants. So he's basically saying, I would never request this at this moment. Being somewhat facetious, I think. The road here is long. It's a process all of you have lived through, one entailing many years of preparatory study. What I do ask, however, based on my own limited experience as a revolutionary and rebel comandante, is that the present students of the University of Las Villas understand that study is the patrimony of no one, and that the place of study where you carry out your work is the patrimony of no one. It belongs to all the people of Cuba, and it must be extended to the people, or the people will seize it. And I hope, because I began a whole series of ups and downs in my career as a university student, as a member of the middle class, as a doctor with middle class perspectives and the same youthful aspirations that you must have, and because I'm convinced of the overwhelming necessity of the revolution and the infinite justice of the people's cause, I would hope, for those reasons, that you today, proprietors of the university, will extend it to the people. I do not say this as a threat, so as to avoid being taken over by them tomorrow. I say it simply because it would be one more among so many beautiful examples in Cuba today. That the proprietors of the Central University of Las Villas, the students, offer it to the people. And to the distinguished professors, my colleagues, I have to say something similar to you. Become black, mulatto, a worker, a peasant. Go down among the people, respond to the people. That is, to all the necessities of all of Cuba. And when this is accomplished, no one will be the loser. We will all have gained. And Cuba can then continue its march towards the future with a more vigorous step. And you will need to include in your cloister this doctor, this commandante, this bank president, and today, professor of pedagogy, who now takes leave of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have about 20 minutes for questions and answers from the audience.
Yes.
So we're dealing with these transnational corporations, and now we're facing TPP, which is basically going to give these corporations the right to private tribunals on whether or not we hurt their profits if we put in like an environmental law or anything else. I mean, how do you see that affecting things?
TTP, Trans-Pacific Project, which has, partnership, which has been described as NAFTA on stilts, or NAFTA on steroids. And it's very amazing because if Japan joins, very likely will. I know Abe was in Washington recently, right, to visit with Obama. If they can get Japan in on this Trans-Pacific Partnership, then this will be probably the most powerful economic bloc in history. Now, NAFTA, it's interesting, in 1994, January 1, the Zapatista uprising began in Chiapas. I was there just, I guess, didn't you? When was that? About a month ago? We went?
Chiapas?
Chiapas.
December last year.
In December, okay, no, sorry, in December. I thought it was about, that seems like a month ago.
That was the Guadalajara.
Oh, that was Guadalajara, okay. Yes, that's true, you're right. In San Cristobal de las Casas, where the uprising began, the Zapatistas understood immediately what the NAFTA, free trade, so-called free trade agreement would do to Mexico. The free trade agreement, the NAFTA free trade agreement, was between Canada and the United States and Mexico. And of course, the Zapatistas understood it would create more Mexican millionaires, but also have devastating effects on the poor, and especially the campesinos and the indigenous groups throughout Mexico. And of course, the Zapatistas proved to be absolutely correct in their assessment. Of course, after January 1st, 1994, they haven't fired a single shot. The uprising was a military one for one day. And thanks to Sokamanani Marcos and his kind of charismatic leadership and the leadership of women primarily in the Zapatista movement, the Mexican government didn't move in and wipe out the Zapatistas as they might have otherwise. But yes, this is something that's quite scary. It's being done in secret. I don't know exactly what the impact might have on universities, but I know that it will probably be absolutely severe. It'll help push public education further into the abyss, and it will certainly be a victor for the forces of corporatization and privatization, unquestionably. I think eventually we're going to see, systems of education, like maybe Norway will sell us its, educational system at some point, or we'll purchase it from Finland or Sweden. It's got to that point, actually. So that's something to be very wary of. And, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in my mind, is all about the pivot to Asia by Obama to try to destroy China. So, and it will cause severe harm to China's economy. Of course, the United States is dedicated to never let another so-called superpower rival its own existence. And so its pivot to Asia, when I first heard that Obama is now pivoting to Asia, I thought, oh, that's scary, but at least it'll take some of the pressure off of Venezuela. But no, the United States is too big and strong and powerful for that. So I'm very wary, very nervous about that and the impact that might have in higher education, especially. Are there any other? Yes.
Could you comment a little on your hope for the future? Because you've been involved as a teacher educator.
Yeah.
You've taught generations of people. If you could pick one thing to tell a group of emerging teachers to be hopeful, what would that be?
Well, I am hopeful. I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And there's, I think, a big distinction. I'm hopeful. I think hope has to be conjugated with struggle. I think that's something that came from Cornel West, I think. He wrote that somewhere, and it stuck with me. I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful. And I always, it's interesting. I used to sort of say, if you just reach one or two students, and make a change in their lives, that everything's been worth it. But I don't believe that anymore. If that's what, 50 years in teaching has done, helped you reach a handful of students, no, that's not enough. But I am hopeful in the sense that of what I'm seeing with young people today. I think that it's funny because there was always a big conflict with me with the younger generation. I always thought, being sort of a 60s guy, that you guys need to, when I'm speaking to young people, hypothetically, you guys need to really learn from what we did. But now I'm looking at the kinds of organizations and the kind of militant resistance by groups of young people all over the world, and that's what's giving me tremendous hope. And the kinds of self-sacrifice, the amazing ability of young people to fashion themselves against neoliberal education has been absolutely amazing as far as I'm concerned. Now in China, that's going to be a different story. I've just been asked to create a center for the study of critical education in Chengchun. That'll be a different kind of struggle because it's the same kind of censorship that you have. But I think that any struggle you have has to be transnational in scope. And I'm finding that. I have the privilege of being able to travel in so many places, in so many countries. And I've seen, and I've just been absolutely amazed at the kind of organizing skills, the ability of young people now to grasp the difference between, Keynesian capitalism and neoliberal capitalism. I mean, young people now can distinguish between forms of capitalism, and they're becoming much more sophisticated in their understanding of economics and how it works and how it's connected to larger structures of power than my colleagues and comrades and friends in the 1960s. So that is giving me a great deal of hope. And the kind of courage that they have and they've shown in the face of adversity has been tremendous. And I think that the example of Paulo Freire, of course, is an incredible example. But I could give you one. Let me give you one example, and I gave it to a class yesterday, Ramin's class yesterday. I'm often asked, well, Peter, you write about critical pedagogy. You've written about critical pedagogy for many years. And I'm often asked in Latin America, primarily, it must be incredible what's happening in North America. And so can you give us all these examples? And I'm taken aback, and I'm saying, I'm here to get hope from you. Because critical pedagogy has become a publishing industry. There's so much being written, but not much being happening in the schools. There are isolated teachers that are working valiantly to promote critical pedagogy, critical thinking, critical literacy, critical media studies, and that's really something that's wonderful. But they're isolated, generally speaking, and they can be cut off, and they can be surrounded, and they can be let go. So that is a big difficulty. So I remember I went to Colombia, Medellin. I guess it must have been about 3 or 4 years ago. I can't, as you can tell, I can't tell time because everything's collapsed in my mind. But I'm saying about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I was speaking at a sociology, Latin American sociology conference. I can't even remember what I was talking about. But it was basically to Latin American academics. And a bunch of high school teachers saw me there, and they ran up to me and they said, can you kind of blow off this conference? You really need to be with us. You need to be with the teachers. We work on the ground. You've already given your talk, Peter. And I said, sure, let's go. So they took me to their school called La Independencia, which is in the outskirts of Medellin, right? And they took me on a tour of the community. They took me on a tour of their school, which was, at the time, I don't know what it's like now, but at the time it was a middle school, elementary school, and high school together under one edifice. And I walked in, and I met the students and went from class to class, and then they said, we want to have a private meeting with you, Peter, just the faculty and you. So I sat down in a room kind of not as big as this, maybe half the size, and they asked me all kinds of questions. They said, look, your work gets translated into Spanish, but not your recent stuff. So we're in a time lag here, about 5 years. So what are your new thoughts about critical pedagogy? And so I gave them a talk, kind of similar to this talk. I said, look, I believe that critical pedagogy should be reconceived as revolutionary critical pedagogy, and we should all engage in the struggle to build a socialist alternative to capitalism. We need a social universe outside of capital's value form, and I don't mean values in terms of morality. I'm talking about the valorization process, wage labor, for instance. And so I'm basically citing Marx, Capital 1, right? Marx's Capital, Volume 1. And they looked at me, and they looked a little nervous, and they looked a little edgy, and I could see the anxiety in the audience. And I said, what's wrong? Did I say something wrong? I said, my Spanish, I had somebody helping me. I said, maybe I'm not getting through. And they said, no. We understand what you're saying, Peter. But if we talk like you, we're going to be killed. And I said, aren't you exaggerating? You're going to be killed. And they said, well, let me show you something. So they walked up to the front of the room. They hit a button. And there was a slideshow they had. There was a computer module, kind of computer screen, an old computer. They hit it. There were pictures of students holding up their hands, holding up white sheets, and bodies on the ground. And I said, well, what is this? And they said, well, this is what happens when we talk like you. And I said, you need to be more specific. And they said, well, we had a visit a few years ago from the state. And I said, you had a visit from the state? Okay. I said, I'm still not getting you. And they said, well, no, the government came. And they came to our community. And they came to our neighborhood here in the school in the form of 2 Black Hawk helicopters, a tank, armored personnel carrier, 4,000 troops. And when they left our community, something worse happened. The paramilitary came through. They swept through. They pulled people out by their hair on the doorsteps and shot them in the head. So Peter, we love your work. We love Paulo's work and Giroux's work and other people's work, but we can't use the language. And I had failed to listen to Paulo's advice. And Paulo's advice to me was, Peter, you know, the language. You know, I love poetry, and Allen Ginsberg, back in the 60s, was one of my mentors. So I love to write. I'm trying to reinvent a language, an academic language, make it more beautiful, more metaphorical. And but people often can't understand me. And Paulo said, Peter, you're a teacher. That means you're a translator, and your job is to translate your ideas into the contextual specificity of where you find yourself. So here I was in Colombia, not realizing they're in the middle of, I knew it, but it just never dawned on me, they're in the middle of a civil war. And this was an Afro-Colombian community. And I said, well then, how do you approach critical pedagogy? And they said, we touch the hearts of the students. They're suffering trauma. They've lost family members. And we treat the affective domain. And we speak to their heart. And they had this amazing program in critical pedagogy. She said, we do what you suggest. We connect private problems to larger social issues. But we don't use the language of revolutionary, right, of Marxism, for instance. And so, some of my students at UCLA around this time were developing what's called eco-pedagogy. Richard Kahn and other people were basically taking critical pedagogy, revolutionary critical pedagogy, but using another language, a language of eco-socialism, of sustainability, without the kind of Marxist discourse and rhetoric. And so very often I will, when I'm, depending on the audience, I will choose a different language that has the same kind of political import. So, but it's groups like that. I mean, it's interesting. Every school that I went into in Colombia, I went into about 5 or 6. Every school had a wall devoted, a mural, with paintings of all the teachers that had been assassinated, because they belonged to a union. As a matter of fact, I talked to one of the heads of the union. I can't remember exactly the union, but I remember talking to him. And he said, Peter, every head of the union, since the beginning of the union here in Colombia, has been assassinated. And I know that that's probably going to happen to me. What courage! I mean, I just felt like, people say, Peter, you take risks, and, blah, blah, blah. Man, I just felt so humbled. I just felt, my God, teachers are putting their lives on the line for their young people. And I'm not suggesting that, I would never suggest that that's the litmus test of a critical educator. But, it's being in situations like that, I think, and I remember when I first came to the United States, it was 1985. Around 1987, I got a call from a guy called Marvin Garcia from Pedro Albizu Campos, Puerto Rican High School, in West Town, Humboldt Park, Chicago. And he said, Peter, would you come and speak at our school? I said, I don't know your school, but tell me about your school. He said, we've just won the award for the best alternative high school in the United States, and we were supposed to go pick up our award at the White House. I said, well, congratulations, when is the big day? He said, no, we were supposed to. This was some years ago. He said, instead we got a visit from 60 FBI agents with sawed-off shotguns, who came and smashed up the school. We just gave this school an award, by the way, Angie, in March or April, this April, at the ARA convention. We gave the school an award just recently. Why did the FBI attack the school? Because the founders of the school were Puerto Rican political prisoners. And they felt that somehow the school was a dangerous school. And I could tell you, give you examples of other schools like this. Samias del Pueblo in East LA.